Summer is nearly over, and the spooky season is almost upon us. What, you don't start celebrating Halloween throughout all of September and October? Ha, nerds. Horror movies have always been a passion of mine, and for so many others. It is one of the only film genres that can attract fans to a convention to celebrate it. Nobody goes to period drama cons, or fills out convention centers for screwball comedies. Pop culture meetups are generally confined to horror or science fiction. People love this stuff. In contrast, horror is also one of the only genres that many avoid altogether. I love all movies, someone might say, except horror. This avoidance generally goes beyond simple disinterest. Some people are nauseated by blood or have suffered a trauma that makes being startled extremely uncomfortable. Nevertheless, someone who avoids horror movies may still be curious about the genre. How can someone who actively avoids horror movies due to physical repulsion find a way into the fandom nonetheless? What is a good entry point to the genre? Rather than simply recommending the best that horror has to offer, the entry point needs to be suited to the viewer, suited to the reason why they have avoided horror in the first place. Horror movies are designed to stretch beyond limits, the limits of sanity, the limits of reality, and sometimes simply the limits of good taste. Because of this inherent need within horror to break taboos and shock the audience, there can be a great deal of blood and gore. Slasher films, a subgenre of horror, are particularly bloody, and with each passing sequel, the kills become more elaborate to satisfy an audience that is now jaded due to the kills in the preceding entry. However, not everyone can stomach the sometimes excessive amount of blood and gore that ooze all over the horror genre. Some people become disgusted by blood or even nauseous. Nobody wants to have to run out of the living room or theater to visit the bathroom in the middle of a movie. Fortunately, not all horror is the slasher subgenre, and not all horror contains graphic scenes of severed heads. The Babadook is the story of a mother and child who are still grieving the loss of the child's father. All hell breaks loose when the mother reads a story that seems to have a life of its own. Although it is frightening, nobody is put on meat hooks or disemboweled. The Others is a modern take on the gothic horror, and it's honestly worth watching just for the soundtrack. Paranormal Activity reignited the horror audience's love affair with found footage and is more creepy than gross. Psycho contains a little blood circling the drain in the famous shower scene, and this fairly tame image of chocolate syrup on the detective's face, but it has nothing to make anyone nauseous. Perhaps the most obvious way to test the waters of horror for the gore-phobic is by watching classic 1930s monster movies like Frankenstein. All these films are fine entry points for someone interested in horror, but not interested in feeling sick. Horror movies often employ jump scares, moments in the narrative in which everything is either deadly quiet or only gentle music is playing. Then suddenly, without warning, boo! Jump scares can be overused, but if done well, they can be highly effective. There are variations too, such as the fake out, followed by the real jump scare. Horror movies provide the thrill of being scared without the danger of consequences. No matter how frightening a movie, Freddy Krueger is simply not going to come through the television set. There is nothing in the closet. There is nothing under the bed. However, sometimes that knowledge is not enough. Some people do not enjoy being startled. Not everyone experiences the same moment with the same consequences. Everyone is built differently. Sometimes this avoidance of being startled is due to trauma or necessitated by a medical condition, often a heart condition. For those reasons, some people avoid horror movies. However, there are actually a great many horror movies that have no jump scares and instead rely primarily on atmosphere to build its dread, its unease. These movies are excellent entry points for those who want to experience the terror but not be startled unexpectedly. Seven has some tense moments, particularly the climax, but not many instances of someone leaping out from around the corner. The Witch creates terror through its isolation and through its mystery. A child has gone missing and the family begins to turn on each other. Isolation as horror can also be found in Midsummer and The Blair Witch Project. All three are quite different from one another but employ a similar isolation as dread. Buried creates its terror through claustrophobia and suspense. A man has been trapped underground and must find a way out. The Innocents is a classic horror movie that is effective through its atmosphere and not knowing what is real. Is there a ghost? Is it only her imagination? Any of these films would be a good way to start watching horror movies if the main concern is jump scares. Be warned, however, that 7 is quite graphic and would not be suitable if the problem is both jump scares and disgusting content. Fear is the most primal of emotions, and perhaps because of this, horror is able to challenge its audience in ways that other genres cannot. Although horror can reach amazing heights, it can also be home to the depths of cinema. Horror has long been the subject of criticism for its portrayals of women and an overall lowbrow vibe. This perception is not entirely unearned, as there are a number of entries into the genre that might best be avoided. It would be disingenuous to ignore the downside of horror, the negatives. If someone is avoiding horror altogether because of a subsection of horror that is too lowbrow, they might enjoy something more thoughtful. Get Out is a tense, suspenseful horror movie about race. Us is an excellent companion piece to it and a provocative work on its own. Hereditary is a powerful movie about family trauma. It Follows, well, there is a lot going on there. Horror has always had highbrow examples, but modern horror has been pushing this elevation of the genre over the past 10 years or so, with some spectacular results. This is going to be a tough one. The conceit of horror is that it is meant to scare the audience in one way or another. Don't like blood? Watch a horror movie without blood. Don't like to be startled? Watch a horror movie without jump scares. Don't like to see women objectified or low-budget schlock? Watch a better horror movie. But how can someone enjoy a horror movie if that someone does not want to be scared at all, but is still curious enough about the genre to give it a try? Some people want to face their fears. Well, there are 2 ways to go about this. First, if the viewer believes they might be willing to be scared if they ease into it, the best entry point might be a horror movie that is not especially scary and then slowly subject themselves to scarier and scarier content until they reach their limit and know what they do and do not want. The Sixth Sense is not that scary. It's a great movie, but it's not that scary. This is also true of Signs, though great might be an exaggeration. If neither of these movies turned the viewer away from horror forever, they can move on to Scream or The Cabin in the Woods, which are a bump up in terms of horror but are also harmless popcorn movies that won't give anyone nightmares. Though if someone is entirely new to the genre, some of the references in either movie might go over their heads. If neither of these cause the viewer any trouble, they can move on to A Nightmare on Elm Street and go from there. Second, if the viewer believes they will simply never be an Elm Street kind of fan, they can always try horror comedies instead and see what comes of that. Maybe the comedy will provide some relief between the scary stuff. Gremlins is a classic horror comedy, full of cute creatures as well as monsters. What We Do in the Shadows is far more comedy than horror. It's a comedy that simply takes place in a horror setting. These movies might be a good entry point to someone skittish about horror altogether. Well, this is an easy one. Sometimes people avoid the horror genre just because it looks imposing and they simply do not know where to start. If there are no limitations like blood, jump scares, or anything else, some basic, universally accepted recommendations will suffice. The Exorcist is widely considered one of the greatest horror movies of all time for a reason. It's disturbing, intense, and full of great performances. Alien is the absolute peak of sci-fi horror, boasts an impressive cast and some of the best practical effects of its time. For something more down-to-earth, you can't go wrong with Misery. Might be best to look away during the hobbling scene if you have a sensitive stomach. If you run out of English language horror, there is an entire world of horror movies waiting. I could go on, but I hope this has been helpful to anyone interested in horror but has avoided the genre for one reason or another. You don't have to dive headfirst into the pool. You can just dip your toes in as slowly as you want.